read a very interesting book a while back called The Wealth and Poverty of Nations that was written by a Harvard emeritus professor of history. And one of the things that he claimed, I liked it, I thought it was very smart, was that the only true natural resource is interpersonal trust. If you can set up a society where people trust each other, then it will instantly become rich. And he used the example of Japan, which is a very conscientious society and very rich society, but the Japanese have no natural resources, right? None to speak of. And yet they're rich. And then you have countries like the Soviet Russia and much of South America where there's just natural resources that, you know, they're just like Venezuela. It's just more natural resources than you know what to do with. And the places are absolute catastrophes of cynicism and corruption. And so he attempted to document the relationship between default interpersonal trust among citizens within countries and their productivity and their GDP and their standard of living, and found a very, very tight relationship. And I like that a lot, and I've got a story about that quickly that I think is very interesting. I'll tell you two stories. One sort of generic. Well, I'll tell you one personal first. So one day, I lent my car to one of my graduate students, and he took it to Montreal. It was this old Cadillac. And it was a really bad rainstorm in Montreal, and he was in one of the highways that are like set into the ground, and there was like 6 inches of water, and he was turning a corner, hit the brakes, and skidded on the water and smacked it into the wall and on the corner of the bumper, you know. And so then he brought it back, and he was very apologetic about it. And his name was Matt Shane. I'll tell you that because Matt might hear this, and I can shame him a bit for doing this 20 years ago, you know. And he's a professor at the Ontario Institute of Technology, I think now, and quite a successful one. But anyways, he brought the car back, and I went and got it evaluated for damages. It was like $1,700 or something to repair it, or maybe more. But it was almost as much as the car was worth. And I thought, well, I'm not going to do that. So I went online and I typed in the part, and if you do that, you can get people to bid on sending you a used part from all over North America. So that's kind of cool. So there's all these junk dealers have got together, and they have this, you know, network of communication. So you put in the car part, and then they send you a bid. And so this guy said, well, I'll send you the bumper assembly, which is the whole bumper and the lights, for like $250. And I thought, yeah, okay, you could do that. That'd be good. So then I said yes, and then he called me up. About half an hour later, this guy from way down south, he had a really deep sort of Mississippi accent, and he said, wait a sec, was that for the bumper or the bumper assembly? And I said, well, it was for the bumper assembly. He said, oh, I thought it was for the bumper. And then he said, but that's okay, I'll send it to you anyways. And I thought, well, that's pretty good. So I said, well, thank you, and then I hung up, and then half an hour later, he called me up again, and he said, look, I just went out and looked at that bumper assembly, and there's a plastic trim piece on the side, and it has a scratch in it, and I thought I'd better tell you that just in case you didn't want it. And I thought, wow, that's so amazing. It's like, there's a miracle, man. It's like this guy, he's somewhere in Mississippi. I'm never going to see him again, ever. I'm never going to have any contact with him. Like, he made a bad deal, right? Because the part was worth more than he decided to sell it to me for. But he stuck with this deal. And then he went over and above the call of duty. He said, well, this part that I'm selling to you for way less than it's worth is damaged. So I thought I'd better tell you. It's like, man, you got to recognize a miracle when you see one. That was a miracle. So I said, hey, look, thanks for calling, man. It's okay, I can handle the scratch, send the part. And he did, and I got the car fixed and forgave Matt, and you know, it had a happy ending. So that's trust, right? Because I didn't know him from Adam, and he's a primate full of snakes just like the rest of us. And yet he was willing to simplify himself to the point where I could just take him absolutely at his word. And that meant we could trade even though we were strangers. It's like, man, do not underestimate the utility of that. And then there's eBay. So when eBay first started, you know, the idea was it's not going to work because you'll send me junk and I'll send you a check that bounces, and that'll be the end of eBay, right? And so these escrow agents popped up so you could insure your transaction with them. It was for like 10% of the transaction. They would get the check and the goods and make sure that they were okay and then send them on or insure the transaction. But what happened was the escrow agents didn't make any money. And the reason for that was no one cheated. Now you think about how amazing that is, right? You bring these people together across a whole continent. They've never seen each other before. They're never going to interact with each other again. And this was before there were any reputation ratings on eBay. And yet the default transaction was you describe your goods honestly, including their flaws. You set a reasonable price. I decide to pay you. You ship the goods, and I pay you. And it works. And what happened was that eBay produced a tremendous amount of capital that was previously frozen. So frozen capital is when you've invested money in something, but the thing is no longer useful to you, so the money is just sitting there frozen, right, so to speak. And you can't get it loose because, well, you've got an attic full of junk. How are you going to get rid of that? Oh, eBay. And so all of a sudden all these things that were just junk became valuable and everybody got richer. And none of that would have happened without the covenant that we established between each other that's predicated on trust. And so you might say that trust is the currency. And currency is trust because it's a promissory note, right? And if people lie, then the currency gets debased very, very rapidly. And so the economy runs on trust. And so that's part of the overarching covenant. So Abraham makes this covenant with God, and he decides that he's going to aim high and live a good life and tell the truth, and that puts this boundary around him. It's like a walled garden. It's like a walled garden. And inside there's all sorts of things that are happening that are complex and difficult, but outside there's a boundary. And the boundary is, well, maybe things won't. It's like God says after the flood, he says, I'll never send a flood again. That's part of the story. And so there's an intimation there that no matter how bad things get, they won't get so bad that they'll be catastrophic. But there's a coda to that, which is that you have to maintain the covenant. And we don't know what that means, because, you think it's pretty obvious that if you treat people well, if you really think about it, and you're not being naively optimistic and like, a nice, good person with all the weakness that intimates. If you're being hard-nosed and sensible, you understand that if you treat people, if you trust people, that's an act of courage. If you're not naive, right? If you're naive, it's an act of stupidity, because you might get bit, and you probably will. And if you're naive and you get bit, you will suffer for it. It'll traumatize you. But if you're not naive and you know you can get bit, then you might ask, well, what should you do with people? And the answer is you should trust them. And not because you're naive, and not because they couldn't betray you, and not because you don't know that they could betray you, but because if you hold out your hand in trust, then you're inviting the best part of that person to step forward, and that won't happen unless you take that initial step, and that's courage, not naivety. And so to trust someone once your eyes are open, that's an act of courage, and that opens up the world. And you might say, okay, and so there's this idea in this story that you can withstand a fair bit of the catastrophe of life by establishing the proper covenant and by acting in a trustworthy manner and extending your hand to people properly. And you might say, well, okay, that's sensible. I can understand how that would work. And I can certainly see how the opposite wouldn't work, because, if I have to be absolutely terrified that you're going to betray me at every possible moment, and we're in a negotiation, we're not going to get any work done, man, because I'm going to be figuring out what you're up to all the time, and you're going to be figuring out what I'm up to all the time, and we're just not going to get anywhere. You'll come and say you're going to do something, and I can just simplify you. I can say, you're going to do what you said you do. I don't have to worry about you. And then the same applies to me, and then we can go do something, and that's how we generate wealth. So then you might say, well, what's the ultimate limit of that? Like, we know that there's corruption in our society, and that people betray each other, and that there's deceit and all of that, and it causes things like the periodic collapse in 2008, which was complicated, but was partly engendered by corruption. Like, what would be the upside if we really determined to act honestly? What do you think it is that people would be able to do with the world if we stopped acting in a corrupt manner? I mean, what is the upside? Do you think we could how far back could we push aging, do you think, if we hit it hard for 50 years? Could we triple our lifespan? It wouldn't surprise me. All these terrible diseases that beset the planet, we could get rid of them. There's no reason for hunger and starvation. We make enough food. It's like, what would happen if we stopped acting badly? How much better could things get? Well, you start locally, I think. You start with yourself and you start with your family. But, there's intimations of the divine. There's intimations of the kingdom of God. And the covenant with God in the Old Testament, it's like you think, well, we speak secularly. You think, well, that's an unprovable assumption. It's like, well, we'll just hold on a sec. What's the assumption here exactly? What is the upper end for humanity? I mean, who's going to say, right? Who's going to say, especially in this day and age, man? There's so many things happening that you can't even comprehend them. What could we do if we put all of our effort into it? Well, you can experiment with that because you can start in your own household. You can start in your own room. And you can make miracles happen in the confines of your own space. There's no doubt about that. All you have to do is try. You'll see that that happens. And people are writing to me and telling me that they're trying this and that that's exactly what's happening. And so we don't want to be too cynical about where we might be headed.